So, hello everybody. My name, as you know, is Sarah Puntan-Galea, and I'm the director of the Chagos Conservation Trust. And whether you're dialing in tonight from the UK, like today's talk team, or all happen to coincidentally be based in South Wales or London, like our speaker, or you're currently lucky enough to be on the beautiful Chagos Islands for real and not just our backdrop, or anywhere else in the world, I want to warmly welcome you to the Trust's second members talk, but the first one for members only, but also for the UK Overseas Territories Conservation Forum members as well. And who better to be our speaker tonight than Dr. Colin Clubbe, also a CCT member, and one of our trustees and scientific advisors, plus an expert on the plants that grow on the beautiful Chagos Islands. So Colin is currently an honorary research associate at the world-renowned Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, where he used to head the conservation science department before he tried to retire. But for obvious reasons, both Kew and us at CCT refused to let him go. He's a conservationist botanist by profession with more than 30 years experience working on the conservation of island floras. And for the past 2 decades, he's focused most of his time working with partners in the UK overseas territories, including the Chagos Archipelago. And he's had the opportunity to visit and work in most of them. Colin's expertise covers plant inventory and monitoring, conservation assessments, invasive species, and helping governments and other national, local entities to develop conservation strategies and policy. He's also served on other boards, including Falklands Conservation, as well as being on the Darwin Plus advisory group. And he's helped develop and implement capacity building programs for many territories. His research focuses on the study of plant diversity and threats, particularly the impact of invasive species. And Colin has developed strategies for the conservation management of plant diversity. He has the overall aim of helping to provide solutions to the world's plant and fungal conservation problems based on rigorous and evidence-based research. So it's my pleasure to hand over to tonight's speaker to give his talk entitled Plants of the Chagos, an area of the archipelago's environment we so often overlook to talk about Chagos marine wildlife instead. But tonight, Colin will assure you that the plants on the islands are just as cool and interesting as any
Mm.
turtle or shark species in its waters. Over to you, Colin.
Well, thanks, Sarah, for such a generous introduction, and thank you all for tuning in this evening to hear about the wonderful plant life of the Chagos archipelago. Now, for those of you who are less familiar with Chagos, it lies at the heart of the Indian Ocean and is made up of 5 atolls. And if I just use my screen here, I'll try not to wiggle this around too much, but broadly going from north to south, you've got the Perospanos Atoll here, the Solomon Islands, the Great Chagos Bank, which is the world's largest atoll structure, the tiny Egmont Islands here, and the Diego Garcia Atoll, and several of these sort of submerged reef systems within it. The total land area of Chagos is about 4,370 hectares, and the whole thing is set within this marine protected area of approximately 640,000 square kilometers. And the whole thing it's pristine ocean, and that's what makes this area so special. Islands vary considerably in size, from less than a hectare, like tiny little islands such as Il Diablo here in the Solomon Islands, through to quite a few that are in the sort of the tens of hectares. So like Il Jacobin here on the screen, also in the Solomon Islands. And then you've got a few larger islands, more than 100 hectares, such as here Ile Anglaise in the Solomon Islands. And finally to Diego Garcia Atoll itself, where the atoll is not broken up into lots of islands like the other atolls. And at 2,720 hectares, it accounts for more than half of the archipelago's landmass, which we said is about 4,370 hectares. And most of that landmass is Diego Garcia main island, with these three small islands at the northern entrance to the atoll itself. And then we have a few that are islands that are a little more than the rocks sitting above the high tide mark, that are relatively inaccessible and treeless. But still, I've had the pleasure of landing on Resurgent Island in the Great Chagos Bank here. This was the shot as the boat was coming in. And there is still some vegetation on there, highly salt tolerant, these small creeping beach colonists that are tolerant of these really exposed conditions. And of course, the other thing it's important for is its seabird colonies. So to the plants, the native flora of Chagos is relatively modest, comprising, well, the jury's still out. I'll come to some of those reasons later on, but between 46 and 50 terrestrial vascular plant species, of which the majority of them are seed plants or flowering plants. Plus, we think possibly 4 native ferns. There are no known endemic species, i.e. species of plants that are unique to Chagos and found nowhere else in the world. And all of these probable native species are relatively widely distributed across the Indian Ocean islands and the neighbouring continental land masses. And this sort of generalized Indian Ocean island flora is likely a consequence of the relatively short time for colonization and speciation on the Chagos Islands that have been above the water for probably less than 6,000 years since the end of the last ice age. Their isolation means that the seeds and the spores needed to get their access across these large tracts of oceans, either on the wind, by the sea itself, which is it's a difficult habitat for most plants, or hitching a ride on the bodies of seabirds. But how do we know all this? Well, this is where the botanists enter the story, collecting and identifying plants and mapping the vegetation. And there's a group of us working on a revised conservation checklist, including Jodie Payton, who's in the audience tonight, I think. Hi, Jodie. Bringing together everything we know about the flora, and we hope to publish this paper early next year. And botanists go to great lengths to collect our specimens and our data. And in Chagos, this means lots of work from boats. Mostly these small outboard zodiacs taking you from the main research vessel to the islands. A lot of wading, a little bit of swimming to get onto the islands. But often, if you see the image at the bottom left of your screen here, a real privilege to be escorted ashore by a pod of dolphins as you head to the next island to survey. And even showing in the middle here, these very shallow reefs. That's my colleague Pete Carr towing me between 2 of these small islands. That's Il Diablo actually in the distance there. And then there's lots of hiking around the island, recording vegetation, collecting plants, trying to understand what the plant distribution looks like, what's there, and collecting the permanent records, either the plants which will become permanent herbarium specimens, records of what's there. And working in Chagos also calls for lots of improvisation when collecting and pressing plant specimens. On the left, most of my pressing was done in the cabin of the ship and relying on the captain's goodwill for a small spot in the boiler room to dry the specimens within the herbarium press there on the bottom left. And my colleague here, Sarah Barrios, on the right, uses here the back of the truck to collect and sort her specimens on Diego Garcia, where obviously there's a bit better access and you've got a vehicle to get around on. So as well as our interest in species identification, we're also keen to find out about their distribution. And here, my colleagues Sarah Barrios and Tim Wilkinson are using a fixed-wing drone to map the vegetation to build up a complete habitat composition. And it really takes dedication, humping the equipment through the tangled vegetation, finding somewhere to set up a tracking station, and then, as Sarah is so eloquently showing, or elegantly showing on the top right there, finding somewhere to actually launch the drone. And the high-resolution images that these drones produce, such as the one on the bottom right on screen, which is of Diego Garcia, they provide us with tremendous detail, enabling us to better understand species distribution and habitat structure. We can also refer to historical herbarium specimens. And the herbarium specimen is basically, it's a press-dried plant with a name attached to it, so a specific name, with a specific date when it was collected from a specific place. And that provides the evidence that that plant with that particular name existed at that date in that particular place. And this is one of the wings, wing C in the herbarium at Kew, which we're always very happy to show people around. It's the historical wing here, opened in the 1850s. And the Kew Herbarium is home of about 6 million specimens and associated data from around the world, the results of more than 250 years of international collaboration and plant collecting. And we're just nearing the end of a mass digitization exercise at Kew, scanning, databasing, and georeferencing all our collections, both plants and the fungi, so the fungarium as well as the herbarium collections, which will be made available via Kew's online herbarium portal, providing a valuable online resource which will be freely available to everyone. So you can log in and view them at your leisure. And the earliest specimens we have from the Chagos archipelago in the Kew Herbarium date back to the British Transit of Venus expedition in 1874 that passed through Diego Garcia. But unfortunately, these early specimens carry very little information, often saying no more than a plant name and an island location. And on this sheet here, you can see there are 3 different specimens that are mounted here. They're all of this little beach halophyte, this salt-tolerant plant that you find on the beaches, called Bacopa monieri, widespread throughout Chagos. It was originally collected here as a specimen of Herpestis monieri, but has since had its taxonomy revised. And the herbarium specimen you see here is what we call a mixed collection because it's got these 3 different collections on it. And if you dig down and look at the labels, this one on the top left was collected in the island of Réunion, close, not a neighboring island within the whole Indian Ocean. This one is Rodrigues. This one is Réunion. And then the one in the bottom right is the one from Diego Garcia. So we've got evidence of that plant existing in Diego Garcia in 1874 when it was collected. This is something that we've kind of frown on today. I mean, this mixed collection with 3 on the same. We're able, paper is much more freely available and affordable these days. And that was really the reason back then, where you find lots of the earliest herbarium specimens in the herbarium on these multiple collections with small notes crammed into the corner. And they're actually quite difficult to interpret. More recently, and with the easy availability of smartphones and online platforms like iNaturalist, really anybody can take a photograph of a plant, post it on the web, and it will get identified. And this image is the homepage of a project set up by colleagues, including Jody, to catalogue the biodiversity of Chagos, which forms an important source of species distribution data. And you can see there with already nearly 5,000 observations there. Now, of course, they're not all plant, but quite a number of those are plants, and they form a really good evidence base because with good quality photographs, which you have in many smartphones now, this really is becoming more widely used. But plants, of course, don't exist in isolation. They form communities. They're associated into communities that are associated with particular habitats. And in Chagos, we can kind of broadly recognize 6 main vegetation types. Although in reality, when you're on the ground, these habitats grade into each other. But it's informative to be able to take you through these the 6 vegetation types to give you a sense of how the plants are assembled and what the islands look like. Closest to the sea are the beach pioneers. These are a handful of small, creeping herbaceous species on the shoreline, highly salt tolerant, which trap and stabilize the stand, starting the process of island building. And 4 of the most widespread ones are illustrated here. The top left here, Cannivalia rosea, the beach pea, Bohavia repens here, don't think it's got a common name, cider persilla, and bottom right, the morning glory, the beach morning glory, Ipomea pesca. As the sand stabilizes and litter begins to accumulate, seedlings and saplings of small shrubs can become established, forming this characteristic littoral hedge on the beach crest of many islands, particularly on the leeward side, the more sheltered side. So this is just above the high water mark. And 2 of the most widespread species here are Scaevola ticada, commonly called scavy, and then in the middle here, the slightly lighter one here, Heliotropium arboreum, the beach heliotrope. And this littoral hedge provides important nesting sites for red-footed boobies. You can see here on the right a red-footed booby chick, very happy in its beach heliotrope home. Behind the beaches and the littoral hedge in more well-drained areas, a community of small trees may develop, which we might call the sublittoral, just behind the beach, the sublittoral thicket, which comprises a small suite of really interesting small shrubs and small trees. This one here, Ocrosia oppositifolia. And also Cordia subcaudata here. And these thickets provide, again, important roosting sites for these very happy looking red-footed boobies here. So already you can see at a habitat level, this relationship and this interaction, that the habitat is not just the plants, but it's providing opportunities for animals and particularly birds and particularly the roosting seabirds. Where the more moist, undisturbed conditions exist, climax forest may be established, which represents the most luxuriant and complex vegetation found on the islands. These forests comprise mature trees which can reach over 20 meters tall and support a wide range of other different species. The most majestic of which, I love this tree, is Pisonia grandis, shown here just sticking up. There's 2 magnificent trees there sticking up above the largely coconut canopy, and the littoral hedge you can just sort of see in front of the coconuts there. And individual trees can be very large and very sprawling, open-limbed. They seem to provide the complex 3-dimensional structure to provide nesting sites. So here, for example, the lesser noddy terns really like this tree to nest in, and they can be seen in very large numbers. For example, I know some work on petite île Guamang in the Perispanos Atoll recorded up to 12,000 pairs of lesser noddies within this kind of this forest environment. So again, really important for nesting birds. And individual trees of Pisonia grandis can really get very large. They really are. It's a lovely, lovely forest. And this one here is actually on Moresby Island. You can get a sense, and thanks to my colleague here, Pete Carr, who's giving me some scale on that individual tree. And it's the only environment where you really start to get up build up a true humus layer. This soft humus from decaying leaves builds up. What we would really see as normal in, say, a UK woodland, which is a relatively rare thing in the tropics. But here, these promote this soft humus, which is a really important nesting site for shearwaters, which burrow into the soft humus to lay their eggs. And I know Pete has recorded 166 breeding pairs on North Brother. Here you can see a very happy shearwater chick in the right-hand side in its nice intact Pisonia forest. Other species that are important as part of the forest community include this beautiful tree, Barringtonia asiatica, sometimes called the fish poison tree. Extracts of it has been used for fish poisoning throughout the region. Has a beautiful, fragrant inflorescence, and these characteristics, beautiful pink stamens here in the middle picture of the open flower. And it's interesting, they again provide important roosting sites. A very happy red-footed booby has built a nice nest here within the protective layers of this quite dense canopy of the Barringtonia. And it's an interesting tree because it will form these forests all along the sort of leeward coast. There's particularly in, say, Diego Garcia, there's some very lovely forests, but some of the other islands where just along, and it almost replaces the littoral hedge because these trees are supremely well adapted to their environment. These big square fruits, which up to about 10 centimeters across, are highly salt tolerant and buoyant, and they kind of bob along the ocean currents quite happy in that saline environment until they wash up onto an island. The waves put them up, wash them up onto the high tide point. The fresh water from the first rainfall washes them out, and they're able to then germinate and establish there and produce this really, really lovely forest. And another widespread tree is this one here, this Calophyllum inophyllum, sometimes called the Takamaka tree, which was widely exploited for boat building in the past, to really produce a really, really nice wood for boat building. And again, it also provides valuable roosting sites for here, for example, the common white tern. And finally, again, one of my favorites, this lovely legume tree called Insia bijuga, which is got these beautiful, big, typical kind of pea-like flowers in these inflorescence here and a typical pod here. So the climax vegetation, the forest, reduced into quite small patches now in many of the islands, is really potentially a species-rich one. It supports quite a number of understory plants, and particularly ferns and fern allies, both epiphytic, so growing on the limbs of the tree directly, such as this bird's nest fern on the left here, Asplenium nidus, and Psilotum nudum, this fern relative down on the right-hand side here. And also, understory plants grow there in these shaded environments, like this other fern on the right there, Asplenium macrophyllum. Where the hydrology prevents tree establishment, savanna-like open areas are established, dominated by grasses, sedges, and small herbs. And these communities are really important for ground nesting birds. They provide opportunities at the top of the slides here for ground nesting brown boobies, as well as ground nesting sooty terns. And without these open areas, these birds would have nowhere to nest. And so that's really one of the values in this. Quite species poor in a way, but some really interesting plants in amongst them. And as botanists say, they're all the sort of difficult ones. They're all the tough things, little sedges, little grasses, which all look the same, particularly when they're not in flower, which they tend not to be when you're out there sampling. Couple of specialized habitats where saline conditions persist, a highly specialized woodland habitat forms dominated by mangroves. But this is a very rare vegetation community in Chagos, with this one on Moresby Island being the most important one of the two known occurrences in Chagos, the other being on Eagle Island. And it's dominated by this lovely mangrove called Lumnitzer racemosa. A second species of mangrove has been recorded, Pemphis acidula, which is more widespread than the Lumnifera, but doesn't seem to form these distinct mangrove communities as we just saw with Lumnifera. It is a smaller shrub occurring on coastal bluffs and along the edges of coastal lagoons or barochois. And these barochois communities here, illustrated in the slide, are a particularly important wetland, providing habitat for dragonflies. They provide a nursery for developing fish and are used by a wide range of birds. So that's a sort of a stroll through the native flora and the habitats that they form across the archipelago. I'd like to now move on to the non-native or introduced flora of Chagos. And what we've seen is that native vegetation has been supplemented by the introduction of non-native species ever since the islands were first discovered by the Portuguese in the early 1500s. And rats most likely stowed away on these ships and were introduced during these very early landings. So rats have had a long history on these islands. Useful plants were introduced during the plantation era, including coconuts. And many other species arrived accidentally with the to and fro movement of people. The next big wave, ornamental introductions to beautify downtown Diego Garcia and other casual introductions increased during the 1970s. And these are really very kind of tentative figures at the moment, because as I say, we're working through these data at the moment. But there's something in the region of 375 probable non-natives. 85% of those, around 316, have only been recorded onto Diego Garcia. They haven't actually got out to the other islands, and that reflects the history and the recent usage of the whole archipelago. And I keep saying probably and approximately, because I say we're still working on these data, but it's very difficult to be certain about the origins of plants, particularly in very isolated areas like the Chagos, where there is not a particularly strong historical plant record. And so it really is, it's a detective game to try and think, is this likely? Is this unlikely? Looking at the global distribution of that particular species and trying to make some decisions. And different botanists have different opinions. And so it's sometimes difficult to reach a consensus. Some people will think one species is native and other people think it's not native. And that's because we just really don't have the evidence. Around the settlements, and this is actually Ile de Coin on Peros Banos, you can see the evidence of these early introductions of useful plants that were grown for food, such as taro here on the bottom left, with the big, huge triangular leaves. That they're often called sort of elephant's leaves as a sort of general common name as well, plants that look like that. And they're grown for its very starchy root vegetable. And taro is native to Southeast Asia, so it was an early introduction here. Top right is pawpaw or papaya, this delicious tropical fruit, which is native to the tropical Americas. It was first cultivated in Mexico, but that's actually widespread around the settlements. And this rather interesting fruit here of the cucumber tree in the bottom right there, which it's a very sour taste. It's used to flavor things like fish, and it's thought to be native from Indonesia. But really, it was the widespread introduction and clearance of native vegetation to plant coconuts for their oil that has had the most significant impact on this whole archipelago. And of course, since the collapse of the coconut oil industry, as things like palm oil replaced it globally, and the bottom fell out of the market, and the abandonment of coconut plantations with the consequent lack of any management, these areas have really spread and become impenetrable coconut forests, which prevent virtually any other species getting established. You can see just on the image here, the whole floor of these areas is matted with huge dead and dying coconut fronds, which really prevent anything growing there. And you're walking through largely a coconut desert there. Perhaps the only organism to really benefit from the extensive coconut plantations is here the coconut crab, which is the world's largest terrestrial arthropod, reaching over 1 meter in leg span and between 3.5 and 4 kilos in weight. And coconut crabs, which are threatened over much of their range, on Chagos comprise one of the most undisturbed populations in the world. But the main impact has really been on the seabirds. The invasive coconuts, they don't provide the three-dimensional structure that native birds, the native trees do, and seem not to be used at all by seabirds, with perhaps the exception of this odd frigate bird, which you'll often see perching in them. Many other species that have been introduced also pose serious threats to the native vegetation, including, for example, this what's called the Australian pine, Casuarina equisetifolia, whose main distribution is Southeast Asia, Australasia, and the Pacific. And on islands where it occurs, and this is actually Île Anglaise, a different Île Anglaise, in Peros Banos, the constantly shedding of these acidic needles, together with the shade provided by them, prevents the establishment of any native vegetation. And so what should be a thriving beach community there is now basically a plant desert because of the presence of these. And then if you add coconut to the mix, this island is really a plant desert. So today, and our restoration goals, basically what we're trying to do now is to move from an invasive dominated Chagos present to a more species diverse, native dominated future. And we can do this by restoring native habitats, and particularly the forests. Is what we would really like to see more of. They are the things that we've lost most of in the past decades. And the key here is to success is rat eradication followed by coconut removal to allow climax forest to re-establish. But also, kind of for the whole biodiversity, there are these threatened habitats that need rescuing. The mangroves here being one example that are becoming seriously invaded by coconuts and overtopped by scrambling vines. And many of you will be aware that our next expedition to Chagos starts next week. And two of my colleagues from Kew are part of this expedition, where they want to establish a vegetation baseline to those islands that rats are being removed from, so that we can monitor the vegetation recovery post-rat eradication and really try and understand what is going on. And can you turn back the tide and to restore a more native biodiverse future? And we're encouraged by earlier pilot studies. A pilot study that was carried out in Barton Point Nature Reserve here on the eastern arm of Diego Garcia has provided some good evidence that native species will re-established after coconut removal. So the combination of rat eradication followed by coconut removal, can provide the basis for successful native forest re-establishment. And even in kind of, you can see here that the whole area greening up as some of the things that are in the hidden seed bank that have been held back for a long time or are brought in by birds or blown in. Really, the whole system can start to change. Mangrove restoration, I put a question mark there because that really provides really some very different challenges. This is, for example, part of, I showed you the nicest bits of Moresby earlier on. This is another area on Moresby Island where you can see the mangroves here are really aging individuals. There's very little natural regeneration. And it's really evidence of a system in desperate decline. And similarly on Eagle Island, the mangrove system there is really being squeezed out strangled out by these coconuts and these overtopping vines. The whole system is drying out. Probably due to, in both cases, where the access to tidal movements of the sea have been blocked by big sand shifts, and so these are sort of stranded habitats which need opening up, and to do that is really, on these remote islands, is really huge. But we still hope that one day one might be able to restore some of these really precious habitats. And so successful restoration is really the key to a better future for native biodiversity. Not only the plants, but also the thousands of birds that nest in Chagos. And this is really the heart of Chagos Conservation Trust's Healthy Islands, Healthy Reefs programme, which you can find out more about on the CCT website. And with that, I say thank you for your attention, and I'm very happy to try and answer any questions you got.